Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, here for another one of my head-to-head videos. In this case, I've got two very similarly priced lenses that we're going to be looking at on Fuji's X-mount. These are standard lenses that are available for well under $200, and 7Artisans very recently, they upped the ante in this space by releasing a sub-$200 autofocusing F1.4 lens. And I think that may be the first time that I've ever seen that before. There exists, however, a fairly obvious competitor, and that's the Viltrox AF 35mm f1.7, and this is from their AIR series, which has proven to be very popular, and for good reason. So which one of these lenses is worth your hard-earned dollars, considering that they come at a pretty similar price tag? Well, that's what we're going to explore here today. Let's jump in and find out. So let's start by talking about what is similar here. And there are a lot of similarities despite the difference in the maximum aperture of the two lenses. Both of them are obviously 35mm lenses that translates on Fuji's 1.5 times crop factor on their X system. That comes out to about 52mm in focal length. And so obviously that is pretty close to what we would call a normal or a standard focal length there. They both have very similar feature sets in that there really isn't any feature set. Both of them have just a manual focus ring on the lens barrel. No other features outside of that. No aperture ring, no switches or dials or anything like that. They both, although they have different maximum aperture and a different shape, they shake out to very similar overall weight. And there's about a 14-gram difference between the two, with the Viltrox being just a little bit lighter. I believe the two figures are 170 grams for the Viltrox, 184 grams for the 7Artisans. As you can see, both of them do come with a lens hood included. On paper, the MSRP for the 7Artisans is about $10 cheaper, and so it's about 169 US dollars compared to 179 US dollars for the Viltrox. However, with discount codes being widely available, one of those being in the description down below, you can get the price of the Viltrox down to where the price is essentially identical or within a few dollars of each other, with the Viltrox being just ever so slightly cheaper. They also both lack any kind of weather sealing other than some coating on the front element. Now, there are a couple of differences that I would classify as being neutral. One of these lenses is wider in diameter, that's the 7Artisans. The other is a little bit longer in length, that's the Viltrox. And so, although there's a difference in the way that they're shaped, the internal volume ends up being pretty similar in the two lenses. Both of them have slightly different approaches to the build, but I would say they have similar degrees of build. They're both based on a metal lens mount. The 7Artisans uses a mix of plastics and metals in the barrel, whereas the Viltrox uses just plastics. However, in terms of the overall build quality and the feel in the hand, the reality is that while they use different materials, the build quality feels about equal between the two. So moving beyond similarities or non-essential differences, let's talk about some actual advantages for each lens, I should say. And let's start with the 7Artisans and the reason to consider the 7Artisans AF 35mm f1.4. The first of those is, of course, that f1.4 aperture. f1.4 is 1/3 stop brighter than f1.7, just like f1.7 is 1/3 stop brighter than f1.8. And so you're going to get a little bit of extra light gathering potential. It means that that's going to have some other impacts as well. Allow you to get a little bit faster shutter speed, allow you to have a tiny bit of an advantage in low light situations. It means also, as we're going to see in a moment, that specular highlights tend to be a little bit bigger, all things being equal. Another advantage here is that the 7Artisans has less vignette than what the Viltrox. It's not quite a full stops difference, but we'll call it between 1/2 and 2/3 of a stop of advantage when it comes to vignette in the edges of the frame. As noted, hinted at previously, as you can see here, there are larger specular highlights. If both lenses are wide open and at the same distance from the subject, you're going to get bigger, softer highlights coming from the f1.4 lens, as you can see here. And furthermore, you can see that if you stop the lens down, say both lenses at f2, those specular highlights are still a little bit bigger, though, as we're going to see that bit of an odd shape starts to creep into the 7Artisans that kind of robs that away. The final reason to choose the 7Artisans over the Viltrox is if you happen to be a person who prefers what I would call a classic type rendering. Not as highly corrected, a little bit lower contrast, wide open, a little bit dreamier as it's sometimes called. And then as you stop the lens down, it steadily becomes sharper and higher contrast as you progress through the aperture range. Not everyone loves that. Some people love modern lens design, but if you prefer the more classic look, you're getting an autofocusing 35mm f1.4 lens for a great price. How about some reasons to choose the Viltrox instead? Well, the first of those is that the 7Artisans unfortunately has an old style buzzy micro motor, whereas the Viltrox has a more modern STM focus motor. So the Viltrox's motor is quieter, it's smoother in operation, and it's also faster. And as you can see here, comparing the two in their cycles, you can see that it just racks back and forth faster. In fact, there was one kind of missed shot, and so we ended up with 6 cycles to 5 cycles over the identical amount of time. However, it probably would have been more like 7 cycles to 5 cycles if it were not for just kind of a glitch in the, as I'm going back and forth in the focus process. I suspect if I had redone the test, I would have ended up with 2 extra cycles compared to the 7Artisans. So, and in real world use, there's really no comparison. The Viltrox feels like a modern lens and it performs quite well on Fuji. We'll also find that the Viltrox is the much better corrected and thus much sharper of the two lenses. And that's true whether you're looking at it wide open, or as you can see here, it's visibly sharper in the center of the frame and even more so sharper in the mid frame. And then if you go to the edges, it is radically sharper in the corners. And even as you stop the lens down, it continues to be sharper basically throughout the aperture range. It is just the sharper of the two lenses, and that's true anywhere you look in the frame. It also has superior contrast. And whether you were looking at something like the test chart, as we've already done, but if you're looking at three-dimensional objects, you can just see in a couple of these comparisons, if you look at the letter A, for example, in this comparison, you can see it's just sharper and higher contrast, all things being equal, even with the 7Artisans stopped down to f1.8, which theoretically could give it an advantage here on the guitar. And if you look at the big guitar string there, you can see where it's coiled, that it's just better resolved with better contrast and better detail on the Viltrox. You'll also find that while neither of these lenses struggles much when it comes to longitudinal style chromatic aberration, the Viltrox has far less of the lateral style chromatic aberrations that affect the edges of the frame and might show up in high contrast areas. And so in this case, it's definitely got an advantage versus the 7Artisans when it comes to that. It also has lower distortion. Its distortion is actually a tiny bit of pincushion distortion rather than barrel distortion is what we see in the 7Artisans, but in terms of quantity, the Viltrox is pretty close to being neutral in that regard, whereas the 7Artisans has some noticeable barrel distortion that does require correction. Now, while we discussed the fact that the 7Artisans has larger, softer specular highlights when both lenses are wide open, as you begin to stop the aperture down, there's no question that the Viltrox has a more pleasing shape. I find that not only do you see the aperture blades on the 7Artisans, but it's just, they're kind of an odd shape that to me I don't like. Your mileage may vary, whereas the Viltrox does a better job of maintaining a circular type shape, even though both of them have 9 aperture blades. One are rounded and the other is not. And also, I would say, maybe a little bit uneven with the 7Artisans. Both of these lenses have a USB-C port for firmware updates, but I vastly prefer Viltrox's design where it's tucked away on the actual metal mount, and so it's never in the way. Whereas on the 7Artisans, they rely on a port down here that's got a little rubber gasket that you have to pull out. It can get snagged on something and get pulled out. That has happened to me on this lens. But more importantly, once you take that gasket out, you have to be careful not to lose this. And so if they would have just located it on the lens mount, as Viltrox does, then you wouldn't have to worry about this little gasket and try to fidget with it, trying to get it to go in and to stay in place. It's not really all that relevant in the real world, but I will note just as a difference that the Viltrox can focus a couple of centimeters closer, 33 versus 35 millimeters, and it has about a percentage point more of magnification. And you can see here with the two things being magnified that the magnification level on the Viltrox is just a little bit higher. You can also see from the secondary shot that it performs better up close, better detail, better contrast, and so that's a secondary thing to consider when it comes to close focus and maximum magnification. You'll also find that the Viltrox has lower focus breathing. And as I do a comparison here, both lenses stop down to about f11. You can see that there's just a far more noticeable amount of breathing, and by that we mean changing the size. And so you can see in the top and bottom lines how they go in and out more compared to what the Viltrox does. And so if you're shooting video, that's going to be an advantage for focus pulls. And on that note, even for video pulls, it's just smoother and less fussing from the Viltrox lens as opposed to the 7Artisans. You'll also find that in basically all real-world conditions, the Viltrox has lower amount of flaring if there's a bright light in the sun. Even this fairly simple shot here with the guitar, you can see that there's some flare artifacts in the side that the Viltrox shows none of. And if you're out in brighter conditions with the 7Artisans, it's certainly going to show a variety of flare artifacts and is particularly susceptible if they're just very slightly out of frame. The Viltrox does a better job with all of that. And so in a lot of the kind of direct ways you can compare the optics, I would say that the Viltrox wins most of those comparisons. So my conclusion is this: these are lenses that have some surface similarities, but they have very different design philosophies. As I noted, the 7Artisans is kind of an old school design. It's simple, it's just 8 elements in 5 groups. It has that more dreamy rendering wide open and continually sharpens up as you stop down. I know that there are some of you who prefer as simple an optical design as possible, and of these two lenses, that would definitely be the 7Artisans. And if you prefer kind of a classic retro type rendering, it's a lens that you may really enjoy. The Viltrox has 11 elements in 9 groups, so more elements and more modern optical design, and it is thoroughly modern in all of its sensibilities. It has high levels of correction, it has excellent wide open sharpness and contrast. It wins basically all of the optical and autofocus comparisons. And yet, of course, there may be some who do prefer the 7Artisans for the simple reason that it has that classic rendering that some prefer. I would say for the mainstream, however, if you happen to fall into the mainstream, very likely you're going to consider that 1/3 less stop of brightness to be well worth it for similar money to get a lens that's sharper, faster, and even a little bit smaller and lighter overall. And for that reason, I would say that for most people, the Viltrox is going to be the winner. However, if you're old school, the 7Artisans might be the one that walks away with the dub for you. If you want more information, you have a couple of options now. You can either check out my full reviews, either text or video, that are linked on both of these lenses in the description down below. And as a bonus, if you want to take a look at how I drew my conclusions and take a deeper look at the optics and head-to-head comparisons between these two lenses, well, stay tuned right now. We're going to jump into that together. Okay, we'll start off our comparisons, and always I'm going to keep the 7Artisans on the left, the Viltrox on the right to avoid any confusion. Now, as far as the distortion goes, you can see there's barrel distortion here on the 7Artisans. There's a tiny bit of pincushion distortion on the Viltrox, though not any kind of really appreciable amount. So both of those can be corrected, obviously, without any kind of difficulty. And in this case, I will also note that the Viltrox has more noticeably heavy vignette in the corners. Post-correction, you can see that both look fine, so no major concerns there. Now, if we look for traditional longitudinal style chromatic aberrations, you can see that on both of them, I would say that they are more similar than different. Now, the Viltrox here on the right has obviously much higher contrast up close like this, but you can see that they both have not very significant, but similar amounts of longitudinal style chromatic aberrations there. What really differs is the amount of lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame. And you can see that if we jump in, you can see that there's a lot of it there on the 7Artisans and almost none of it on the Viltrox. And so that's a pretty significant disadvantage for the 7Artisans. Now, the 40 megapixels of my Fujifilm X-H2 is incredibly demanding, particularly when we look at the results at 200%, which is the way that I test. However, one of these lenses handles that high resolution just fine, the Viltrox, whereas you can see that the 7Artisans look pretty soft by comparison. So much more contrast for the Viltrox wide open f1.4 versus f1.7. And as noted previously, that advantage in the mid-frame is it's much more obvious and significant. And looking down into the corners, you can see that Viltrox is strong down here in the bottom right corner, up here in the upper left, also strong. Looking over here, it's stronger everywhere that we look. If we stop down the 7Artisans down to f1.8, it really doesn't make a difference. I don't think that it really has taken any kind of leap forward, so the advantage kind of remains the same for the Viltrox. If we stop down to f2.8, you can see that the 7Artisans has started to get more contrast in the center of the frame. Problem is the Viltrox has too, and now the Viltrox is basically ridiculously sharp and high contrast, and so it just easily bests what we see from the 7Artisans. And again, that's even more obvious if you look other places in the frame. Here in the mid frame, very obvious. Up in the corners, it's just a significant advantage there for the Viltrox. By f5.6, the difference in the middle of the frame I don't think is as significant anymore. As I noted, the 7Artisans has that classic profile where it just kind of keeps sharpening up. However, if you look outside of the middle, like here in the mid frame, it's still very obviously a win for the Viltrox. And into the corners, they're getting better on the 7Artisans, but they're not great, not certainly relative to the Viltrox and its performance. Now, if we switch over to our minimum focus distance, you can see that here we took a look at that level of magnification, which is just a little bit higher for the Viltrox. And the Viltrox obviously has a little bit more contrast in general, and so it's just a little bit crisper performance than what you're going to get up close with the 7Artisans. Now, what follows is a bit of an interesting sequence with some strengths for both lenses. And so here, wide open, f1.4 versus f1.7, you can notice the faster shutter speed because of that faster maximum aperture. And you can also note that the specular highlights are larger and softer here from the 7Artisans and what they are on the Viltrox. You can also see the advantage for the Viltrox in higher contrast in detail if you look in at the area of focus. Now, what's interesting is if you stop the 7Artisans down to f1.8, so here in theory, the advantage should belong to the Viltrox. However, what you can see is that it's still metering faster, and also the specular highlights are still larger. Now, what they aren't is rounder, and here's where I have a kind of a beef with the 7Artisans, and that is that you just get frankly kind of ugly and lopsided specular highlights when you start to stop them down, whereas Viltrox it's rounder and more consistent by nature. Other thing worth noting here is just the different way that the two lenses render. You can see that lower contrast look, and to my eye, has a bit of a cinematic look, and so in some ways the kind of like out of focus area I think is quite pleasing on the 7Artisans if you take the specular highlights out of the equation. By f2.8, at least these are a little bit more consistent. I don't love that shape, honestly. And here where it's, and towards the edges where it starts to get pinched and inconsistent, I really don't like it. I vastly prefer the Viltrox where it has nice round circular highlights all throughout. Again, you can see that difference in contrast in the overall rendering. And so, depending on your taste, you're going to prefer one over the other, but they certainly are different. Now, the same is true here, again, at f1.8 versus f1.7. And so if we look at the area of focus, higher contrast and better detail for the Viltrox. Looking at the overall rendering, in this image, I don't find a significant difference between the two, and you'll just have to look at it and see which you prefer. This image, a couple of things to note. First of all, you can see there is some flare artifacts from the light that I've introduced into the scene that is just absent on the Viltrox. The Viltrox holds up better in that situation in terms of its flare resistance. It also continues to have better contrast in this situation. However, you can see that as you transition towards defocus, it transitions a little bit more and softer on the 7Artisans, again, even though it's at f1.8 versus f1.7. Finally, just a general look without specular highlights, and so that you can just kind of evaluate defocused area in general. So if you look at the images as a whole, you can see that there's more of a kind of a pop cutout look for the Viltrox image. And if we look in at a pixel level, you'll see why. I mean, there's just a whole lot more contrast on the subject and thus detail that's standing out on the Viltrox versus the 7Artisans. If you remove that from the equation, however, I think that there is something that is very pleasing about the 7Artisans, the way that everything kind of just flows together. And it's defocused, but without the subject kind of popping out in the same way that it does on the Viltrox. This, again, it's very much a taste thing, but if you look at some of these various transitions and the way that the bright areas, there's more contrast here, which is why on the Viltrox it looks brighter on the seat, for example. Maybe you like that. Maybe you like the fact that on the 7Artisans it all kind of just blends together a little bit more. It really comes down again to your specific taste and what you prefer, but again, you definitely can see some pretty key areas where the rendering differs between these two options. Well, thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. I hope that taking a look at these two lenses has helped you to decide which is the one that is preferred for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.